Hey, I'm Zelda, and welcome to dropUp, the podcast that inspires rebels from all backgrounds to pursue their hero's journey. Today, I'm talking with Danielle, the co-founder of the Thiel Fellowship and the 1517 Fund. Those organizations back young entrepreneurs and dropouts to solve the greatest challenges of our century. Before that, Danielle also built an alternative school, a tutors company, and I'm also very lucky to count her as a friend. During our conversation, we talked about Danielle's life mission, bringing freedom to young people, and we also touched on topics such as the difficulty to become an adult in today's society. I'm lucky that Danielle and her team at the 1517 are sponsoring this podcast. Thank you, Danielle, and I wish my listeners a wonderful time with us.
Here you go, Grady.
Yeah.
This is the true
guests.
Danielle experience. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. Sometimes
yeah.
we call the animals our junior associates. We're like, oh.
That's it. I love it. Yeah. Danielle, if we had to tell the story of your life, starting with once upon a time, how would we start that? What would we
Gosh, I think if we were starting, once upon a time, that to me that lends like starting at the very beginning, which I'm like, oh, are we starting that far back? But yeah, I'll do a short snippet of it. But yeah, once upon a time, there was a baby girl who was born on February 11th, 1980, and she was born 2 months early, and so she was very small. I was just a little over 3 pounds when I was born, so I was very premature, and I was almost 3 months premature. And it's kind of a miracle that I made it at all, because the first hospital my mom went to did not know what to do when her water broke when she was over 3 months premature. And it was just fortuitous that, she was raised and brought up in the Boston area, and the Brigham and Women's Hospital was a newer hospital in downtown Boston. So they referred her there, and they specialized in women's care, which, 40 plus years later is still a novel idea.
Wow.
So they had the latest technology and sort of had a better understanding of what to do. So I actually stayed inside my mother's womb for an extra month. They were able to keep me in there. And in fact, I have a scar on my head where no hair grows. So I have like this little bald spot. So I always tell people that, if someone's like the Danielle impersonator, you can be like, show me the top of your head. Because I have this little marker. But yeah, I was inside for, I'm like, now I'm equating this to startups. I'm like, I was incubated for an extra month, had my accelerator with probably extra drugs and all kinds of things to make me grow. And then a month later, I was born and was very little. And it definitely changed my parents' life. And I have an older half brother who, as far as I know, was born to term. But my parents were nervous because my mom was 21 when she had me. And these little funny stories. My mom is a very creative person and a bit of a MacGyver. And so, you can give her a string and a piece of duct tape and a thing, and she'll be like, look, I made some big thing out of it. And you're like, whoa, okay. But when I was born, I was so small that I could fit through the crib bars, so my parents couldn't put me in the crib. So she made me a drawer out of her nightstand, and it was like before co-sleeping was a thing. And so she made, a little place for me to sleep right next to the bed because she was so nervous of like, oh my gosh, what if something happens? And it's interesting because premature children have lung issues, developmental issues, all kinds of different things. And I was able to grow up in a fairly healthy manner, which was great. But it's funny because I always say I'm an East Coaster on the inside, but a West Coaster on the outside. And part of that for me is about time. And on the East Coast, you learn to be sort of early and punctual and all these different things, and the West Coast is more laid back. And I'm like, oh yeah, I was just an East Coast baby. I just needed to come out early. Like that's how it goes. So that's like a very early Danielle story that I don't think I've ever shared on like an interview before.
Yeah.
So I love that you're like, once upon a time, like, well, we'll start at the beginning.
That's fascinating. I feel like it's so interesting. It really connects me to how you've been helping very young people, and that's also something I imagine and that we will be exploring during this episode. Young people choosing unconventional paths, choosing to explore things pretty early. So I find it very, very fascinating, actually. What kind of little girl were you? What were your dreams growing up?
Yeah, let's see. I was pretty sensitive as a kid. I was pretty attuned to what was happening around me. Loved animals, huge animal person. And I always loved taking care of things. That was always something that was true for me. And how it tended to look when I was growing up was I loved teaching. I was, oh, Grady, such a love. Yeah, I was the child who would stay in during recess and help other children with their homework. I learned to read late, so when I learned to read, I immediately taught my younger sister to read because I didn't want her to be in the same position that I was in. And like, you know, I was almost held back in first grade because I couldn't read by the end of first grade. I was like, oh, well, I'm not letting that happen to my sister. So like, you know, when she was, gosh, she must have been like 4. I taught her to read. And
wow. And how old were you?
I was maybe 6 or 7, something like that. And you know, I think I was a bit of a drill sergeant. I think I was just like, this is the word, this, like, and we would just read books and do the things. But it's interesting when I look back at it because, gosh, what is that adage in education? See one, do one, teach one. And I've always been like that, where when I'm teaching something, I am learning it myself at a way deeper level than when someone taught me. So I used to be a private tutor, and I was tutoring all kinds of subjects. And I feel like I got my whole high school education again, a second and sometimes a third time with certain tutoring clients, because I was like, oh, I've got to go in and we're going to work on some history, or we're going to work on algebra or geometry, or like all these different areas. But yeah, from a very young age, I loved teaching. If I was playing like a pretend game, it was not house, it was like teacher. Like, and that's what I just kind of like fit into. I think part of me always liked having a social role, and I think there's something about pretend play where you're getting to try on different social roles. And I grew up in an extremely extroverted family, but I was very introverted. And so my family was always a bit shocking to me, of like, oh my God, my dad's talking to the butcher or the lady in the grocery store line. And for me, it was extremely confronting. I was like, oh my gosh. But if I had like a role, if I was like, oh, I'm like, you know, pretending to be a teacher or pretending to do this, or I always remember, my grandfather used to do something really insightful. My mother's side of the family is Irish Catholic and very big. And when we would go to family parties, they were huge parties. And I was like, oh my gosh, like, you know, I have 8 uncles and aunts, and, you know, there's the grandparents, and just, it's like a 3-ring circus. And so I'd always hide behind my mom, and I would just be nervous. And my grandfather would come out with an old like Polaroid camera, and he'd say, Danny, you're the picture taker. And then he'd give me the camera, and then that would give me the role to like come out from behind my mom and be like, okay, I'm going to take the pictures. But I didn't put this together probably until like 10 or 15 years ago. I was like, oh, my grandfather was so smart. Like, he could see that having a role would like bring me in more connection with people. And that's always been true for me. Even at 15, 17 events, like I probably occur like a pretty extroverted person, but then I go to other people's events and I'm like, oh, like, I'm like, don't make me do it. Like, But I have to sort of apply that role phenomenon. Like I'll go to other people's events and I'm like, okay, my like goal or role right now is I'm going to meet 3 people and I'm going to have a nice connection with 3 people, and I'm not going to try to like network and just work the room, but I'm just going to have like 3 really solid connections and then I can leave.
I love it. Strategies for the introverted people to manage the family to networking events.
Exactly. It's like someone give me the camera at your networking event. And I'll be like, I'm the picture taker. Actually, I mean, I do this where I often prefer to show up early to things in part so that I can help. And then it's like, oh, you need this, platter set up? Great. Yeah, let me do that. Or, oh, you need, this thing put on, these books put on this table. Great. And so it's funny then when people arrive at an event, they're like, oh, are you hosting? I'm like, no. But I love it because then it's giving me that role again so I can feel comfortable and part of something instead of, I don't know, there's something about being an attendee that doesn't feel comfortable for me. Yeah.
It's so interesting because what I imagine hearing you sharing this story is like being set to be an outsider and finding strategies to belong, but still ultimately being an outsider and just kind of finding your ways to be an outsider and to be comfortable with it and to be able to connect with others and all that stuff. This makes me wonder how then was school, because needing to belong as a children is very strong, especially in the current conventional system.
Sure. Absolutely. Yeah, my school experience, in some ways I would say it was fairly normal. I went to public school outside of the Boston area, and I didn't know that anything could be different then, but I got some interesting inklings of things because I took a lot of music lessons, and I was classically trained on clarinet and played competitively in high school and then in college. On the social fitting inside, I was always a bit of a chameleon where I could there's sort of that archetype of there's the different tables at high school of there's the preppy people and the goths and the jocks and the music people. I couldn't hang with the sports people. I didn't do anything sporty at all. I wish I did. Looking back on it, I'm like, oh, I wish my parents had gotten me involved in something more physical, but I was an art kid for sure. But I could very much sort of flow between the different tables at lunch, and people would have a hard time people would want to box me into oh, you're this or you're that. And since a very young age, I very much pushed against ism of any kind. I was ugh, you want me to call myself a thing? Or at different points in my life, I've gotten interested in different types of philosophy, sometimes bordering on things that are spiritual or religious, and people are like, oh, so you're this? I'm like, oh, don't say that to me. It's like nails on a chalkboard. So yeah, a lot of I guess a lot of fitting in school was finding those small groups of people that I resonated with and kind of sticking close, kind of like me hiding behind my mom. I did that with some of my friends a lot too, of oh, this is my friend who I know and am comfortable with. So I had this one friend who walked really fast through the halls in high school, and we had a lot of classes together. So I would literally hold on to her backpack and then just try to move as fast through the halls as she could. So I've not actually put it together of oh, that's kind of similar to how I would be with my own mom, hiding behind her. But yeah, just finding sort of ways to be. And music was a great social outlet. And music is something where you're both very independent in your craft, but you're also very together with other people, and you're listening for tone and resonance and blending and being part of something that's bigger than yourself. And that was always a really beautiful experience for me. But it's interesting to think about when you're younger and you're doing something that you may be both the best you're ever going to be at something and have sort of these last chances for things that are quite profound, getting to play Rachmaninoff and be like with other people. You know, it's one thing to be like, oh, I played it on YouTube in the background and I noodled along to it. It's like, okay, that's fine. But yeah, like that flow state that you can get.
Beautiful. It makes me think of probably the main thing that young people will tell me about school that they enjoy, which is community and the opportunity to explore, to deep dive into music or sport or the arts. What a beautiful experience. What you were explaining and how music kind of got out of your life for a long time makes me think of this transition from teenager to adult and all those changes that you're going through at that time, maybe changing city because you're going to study abroad. I would love to hear more about that experience. I think you studied psychology.
I did. I studied psychology and performance music.
Wow. Fascinating. And this was still in the Boston area?
Yes. Yeah, this was at Simmons College, which is a small all-women's school. And it was interesting to go to a single-sex school because I didn't choose it for that. I actually chose it as a little bit of a gotcha to my dad, where when I was growing up, you know, at some point I was like, oh, I want to apply to conservatory. And he basically said, over my dead body, will you go to music school? Which is so weird because, like, I don't remember how long ago it was. Maybe it was like a year ago. He told me that he wanted to go to conservatory, and his dad told him, over my dead body, will you go to conservatory?
No way.
My dad is a phenomenal guitarist. He's been playing for 50 years. He plays basically every day. And he is like in the sort of old school folk category. But it blew my mind when I was talking to him more recently, and he's like, yeah, no, I wanted to go to conservatory, and my dad said no. And I was like, wait, but you said the same thing to me. Like, that's crazy. So I did the next best thing. I was actually interviewing at Simmons, and I was looking at the school because my guidance counselor, who didn't know me at all, or any student, had just recommended looking at it because it was a small liberal arts school. And I wasn't ready to like spread my wings and go very far from home. Like I still am a homebody. I live 3,000 miles away from my family now. But at the time I was like, okay, I think I want to be within like an hour and a half of like home base. And so that limited my scope a lot. It's always interesting to think about like, oh, there are these forks in the road, and what if I had like expanded my scope in those arenas? But I was interviewing at Simmons, and the interviewer started talking to me about music, and I was telling her about playing competitively and all this, and she was like, oh, well, you must be so excited about our cross-collaboratory program with New England Conservatory. And I was like, you're what? Like, I didn't know they had that. And so she's telling me about it, and, you know, the wheels are spinning in my head of like, oh, cool, that means my tuition can go towards my private lessons, and I can take classes over there, and I can basically do kind of what I want, but do it under the umbrella of a liberal arts school and make my dad happy. And I also got almost full tuition to the school, and so that made the decision pretty straightforward, although I still remember being 18 and getting the acceptance letter in the mail. And there's something that is different about theorizing about a decision versus when the decision is actually real to make. And I think it's really important to like hold what you think you would feel about a decision separate from how you actually feel about the decision. Because I found in my own life these things are sometimes radically different. And I remember applying and thinking like, yeah, Simmons is my top choice. This is where I want to go. I get the acceptance letter. I get the nearly full ride to the school. And then it dawns on me, I was like, wait, I don't know if I want to go. Like, I haven't actually really thought about if I want to go to school. And I said these words out loud to my mom. And like my mom said, over my dead body, like, and I was on her side of the family. And actually, I think on my dad's side as well, I was going to be the first person to like get a BA or a BS degree. None of my family had gone to college. And so they were like pretty gung-ho about that. And all of a sudden I was questioning it. And even my mom said something like, women fought for the right, for you to be able to go to school. And like, I didn't, I hadn't taken speech and debate until later. And I was like, later on, I was like, wait a second, Mom, women fought for the right to make the choice, not that I had to go. In the end, I'm glad that I went. I think for me, the choice of school was very important. Had I gone to a huge, you know, campus, like somewhere like UMass Amherst, I would have drowned in that environment. But my school was very small. My class sizes were no more than 30 people. And I got to, what I say about my time there was that I got to grow into my brain. Like, I did not know what I was capable of. Because I started reading late in elementary school, I got held back in like every subject, because they kind of would just say, oh, she reads late, which means like effectively like she's not too sharp. And so we're going to hold her back in like across subject areas. And so that I got kind of tracked in that way. And it wasn't until later in high school that a couple teachers kind of noticed, like, wait, like you actually need something that's more stimulating than what you're getting. Like, let's put you in an honors class. Like, let's do this. And then when I got to college, at the time, there was a lot more agency that students could have. I could take any class I wanted to. If it was a grad level class, I could sign up for it, and the professor would have to like approve me into the class. But it was very light on like, oh, you have to have these prereqs in this order. And like, I felt like after I finished school, our school and many other schools went to this kind of like, oh, we're going to tell you what you take and when you take it model. And I always felt terrible about that, because going back to it being an all women's institution, I felt really empowered to make choices and decisions, and raising my hand in class was no big deal because we were all doing it. And so it was interesting to get out more into the working world and not have that fear about who's talking or taking up space, or it was just kind of normal to do those things. But then seeing that my school then started essentially infantilizing the women there and saying, oh, well, honey, you've got to take this class in this order in this way. I was like, what? Like, they just got rid of the thing that made this place really work for me. And had I gone even 3 years later, I would have been stuck in an environment that was probably a lot more like high school, where it was like, oh, Danielle's now tracked in this particular thing. And I wouldn't have gotten to like, I always say like grown to my brain. Like I learned that like, oh, I like things that are stimulating and intellectual, and like I can go deep on these things, and not just I'm going to take what someone sort of gives me.
Yeah. I feel like the current school system is making it very complicated to become an adult.
That is so well said. Oh my gosh.
To learn to use your agency and autonomy and to take decisions.
Yeah.
I really wonder why it changed. It became worse, actually. Yeah. So interesting what you explained about receiving your acceptance letter. One of my questions was, did you feel like you found your path while you were studying? Were there any some sorts of meta thoughts about finding your path and feeling right about that decision?
Interesting. I want to bookmark at some point going back to the not allowing young people to grow up in school, because I had an experience recently that blew my mind in that regard, and I would love to talk about that with you. But I'm going to go first into your question about this. It's interesting. I didn't find my path when I was in college. I grew and I developed, and I had more of a sense of my own agency and voice. The best thing that I think I did while I was in college was I took a speech and debate class, which was also turned into a club, where to join the club you needed to take this like speech and debate class where you'd learn how to do stuff. And I remember always feeling hesitant about like saying my opinion or actually debating somebody about something, because it just felt like a skill set I had zero experience with, and it seemed scary, to be honest. And I remembered my first debate tournament I went to, And the nice thing about debate is that it's very structured, and there's like formalities for how you can win arguments and things like that. So it's not like being at a party and someone's just kind of being a jerk and you're like, oh, this person's intolerable, but they sound really good, and so they like look like they're winning the argument, but they're like full of hot air. What's nice about speech and debate tournaments, and I was doing Lincoln Douglas debate, is like it's very specific. And there was my opponent had gone up and was talking about the space industry, and it had nothing to do with whatever the debate topic was. I don't fully remember. I think the debate topic was tort law. And I remember sitting there and I'm taking all the notes I'm supposed to take and doing all these things. And I was freaking out because it was my first tournament, and I was like, I don't want to let my team down, and like, what am I supposed to do here? And this guy sounds really smart. Like, and this is sort of like an archetype I come across of like, this person sounds really smart and I know they're wrong, but I'm not good at articulating why they're wrong. And so, he's going on and on, words. And it's my turn to get up. And so I just, it dawned on me as I'm sitting there taking the notes of like, this person is not actually debating the topic. And so I think I just need to hammer home to the judge in the room that they're way off topic and this has nothing to do with the debate tournament. And therefore I should win the case because they're like just coming in from not even left field, but like hyper left field, like 3 standard deviations out on left field, whatever that is. And I basically argued that and just kept getting up and saying like, no, this is outside the bounds of what we're talking about today. And I won the case. And I was so shocked because I was like, wow, like in my mind, this person was supposed to win because they sounded smart, but they weren't actually smart about what they were doing in this tournament. So it was this big confidence booster. And so I was learning how to use my voice more in school. But what I wasn't learning was how, like, no one, and I don't know how much, like, things like Renee Girard's work or mimetic rivalry are, like, brought up in colleges. But, like, no one was teaching us about that for sure. And I hadn't learned how to recognize when I was doing things because other people would sort of want me to, or how much I would be driven by those types of things. And I didn't know how to use my voice in those arenas. And so as I was going through college, I remember I thought I would get an education degree. But I would go to parties and I would tell people like, yeah, I'm studying education, special ed. And people would be like, oh, and their faces would glaze over and they would like pretty literally turn away from me and like start talking to someone else. And I was like, well, that kind of sucks. Like, and you want to feel included. And then I started studying neurology. And when I would go to a party and I'd be like, oh yeah, I'm studying neurology, people were like, oh, amazing, fascinating, so interesting. And it was like I was getting those social signals and cues of like, oh, I fit in and people see me as smart now. And, like just lots of like that validation that I had been looking for, but in the wrong area for me. Because what I found when I finished school was like I was deeply headed down this neurology path. I was probably going to get a PhD or a PsyD. I had applied to grad school. I worked in a neuropsych clinic. I was the youngest person to intern in the neuropsychology department at the hospital that was across the street from the hospital where I was born, which was a whole other tale of like, hey, ask to volunteer someplace and they'll start making a role for you, because they had never had an intern there that young. And I don't know if they ever have since, to be honest.
That's so cool.
Yeah, it was fun and interesting, but I got so deep down that rabbit hole that it was that same thing of like when the decision is real, then all of a sudden I wake up, I become more conscious. And I got into grad school and I was like, oh my God, what am I doing? I'm like, I've applied to all these schools. I've taken these extra tests. I asked Dr. Margaret O'Connor, who probably still works at the Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, for recommendation. I had gone on interviews, like I was deep down this path. And then I was like, oh my God, what am I doing? Like, am I really going to spend like 7 more years of school getting an advanced degree. And both my parents are self-employed, and a lot of my family is self-employed. And I was like, my God, like, I'm probably not going to have really like worked until I'm 30. Like, that's insane. Like, and like, even if school is giving me like a stipend or something like that, I'm still going to have to like pay to live. Like, it's not like, oh, I just have a free existence or something like that. But it was really this question of like, whoa, what am I doing? And I watched a movie that like, I'm not a big media person, but I watched this movie, Vanilla Sky. And I remember like, I was just in this like real tumultuous place. And I watched this movie, and at least for me, one of the takeaways of that movie was like, you have to live your own life. Mm-hmm. So it was sort of like getting in some of that mimetic stuff, like under the radar. And I was like, I can't go to grad school. Like, what am I doing? And I got this book called Zen and the Art of Making a Living. And it's a workbook, and it's out of print now. But actually, a young man who I recommended the book to recently, I was like, listen, man, I read that book like 20 years ago. I don't know if it's any good. It might, like, maybe I'd be embarrassed about it. I'd be like, oh, this personal development book that actually was terrible, or, you know, whatever. But he read it and he's like, Danielle, this book is amazing. Every young person needs to read this book, but it's out of print. And so he's been like trying to get in touch with the author about like, can we get this book back in print? Like, how do we do this? But I read that book, and it was all about how do you craft a life and a career even if you don't have a degree in something. And so it was like, hey, if you want to become a doctor, or if you want to be in that arena, how do you abstract what that is? And it's like, okay, if you wanted to be an MD, an abstraction of being an MD is like being, you know, in health in some way. And so then are there other avenues where you might say, okay, like I could be in health, but not have an MD? And it's like, there's all kinds of ways to do that. Yeah. And so I did the same thing with education, where I was like, okay, well, I finished school. There's no way I want to go back for like another degree. What could I do in education? And that's where I came up with the idea to start my first tutoring company. And that's when I found my path, was after I'd finished school, after I was like deep on the, I'm going to become a neuropsychologist train, and deep in the like, I'm doing this because other people give me lots of praise for going down this path. And I also got other like negative things about teaching from people, even growing up. Like, people would tell me, you know, it's a terrible profession, it's so grueling, those who can't teach, like all that kind of stuff. And, you know, and my friends who had parents who were teachers were like, don't do it, it's horrendous. Like, and I get why they say that, because yeah, knowing what I know now, I would not want to, like, I would probably, the only way I would want to do it now is like within an alternative education system. And I only learned about those once I started my tutoring company. But it was like getting off the traditional, like I had gotten on the like how you grow up, escalator or elevator. Yeah. And then I like got off. And I remember thinking to myself, part of it was like, gosh, if I wake up in the morning and when I put my feet on the ground, I'm not like, yeah, I want to do it. And like, I liked neurology, but I liked it. I didn't love it. I wasn't reading neurology books in my spare time. I wasn't like thinking about problems in that space. I was like, yeah, it's great. And everyone's giving me, you know, rewards for going down this path. But yeah, it was after college that I figured out like what I would describe as my calling.
Yeah. That's so interesting, because it feels pretty common, especially with a background of all these narratives, whether it's about being a woman or being from a family in which not everyone had the opportunity to study at college. Yeah. And then there is what you described, paths that are way more valued by society and others that are not at all valued by society. No. I find it amazing to hear that you found this later on. I think that in your early 20s, you can feel a lot of anxiety about finding your path. And truth is, a lot of people find it only after 1 or 2 years at college, and they switch path, or after college, or way after.
Yeah, exactly. Some people don't find it.
And some people don't find it. But yeah, I just find it so important to remind the young people listening to us right now that you need to start somewhere, kind of, and on the way I feel like you do figure out what's that deeper calling about.
Right. Well, and for me, I think like one thing that we're not good at thinking about is adult stages of development. We're like really good at thinking about like, oh, children crawl and then they walk and then they run and they do this. We do not think about this at all once someone has like maturated, past like their teenage years. And adult stages of development are very interesting. And I think oftentimes the areas that we have deemed a crisis, like, there's like quarter life crisis, that's like very common. But, even I'd say like 15-ish plus years ago, somewhere in there, people were like, oh, quarter life crisis, like this is a thing. But it's interesting because when people talk about it, they talk about it like a bad thing. To me, it's an extremely good thing. It's like if you haven't had a quarter life crisis or you haven't had a midlife crisis, like to me, you haven't met a developmental milestone. And it's a little bit like irksome to me that like human development does tend to come through. Like we used to always say, with the people that we work with, both at like the Thiel Foundation and Fellowship and through 1517, they want information when the house is slightly on fire. They don't really want it like when things are calm, but that's just the human condition. It's like the time people start reading about relationships is when they're in trouble in their relationship. They're not like, I better prep because I want to be married someday, so I better learn. Like, it's pretty rare for people to act proactively like that. We tend to be somewhat reactive creatures. So I think things like a quarter life crisis and a midlife crisis and so on are actually developmental milestones that our society has kind of deemed like bad or troublesome or something we need to like extinguish. And to me, it's more like, no, how do you come at that with consciousness? Like, and I was lucky in the sense that like my disposition or maybe the people I around were such that they were like, hey, here's some personal development books. Here's a workbook. Like, try this. Like, so I was like in that stressful situation, but also had some people around me who could see it as a positive and not a negative. And so whenever I talk to young people, I'm like, oh, have you hit your quarter life crisis? And they're like, not yet. I'm like, keep trying. Like, swim further out to sea. Like, pop that floaty that you have on. Like something needs to happen. Like, cause it's going to happen, and it's just a matter of when. And like, I don't know. I'm a big fan of being like, if you can get it sooner, like, why not?
Sooner the better.
Yeah. And ideally, sooner, and ideally, like, with a growth mindset and not like, I traumatized myself. Like, it's like, okay, maybe, like we all go through different things, and
with a support system also.
Exactly.
Ideally.
Yeah. But some things we do need to learn on our own. Like, it's it's interesting that I've talked to there's been like multiple like little like spiritual insights in my life where like someone will turn to me and be like, you need to do this thing by yourself. And I'm like, oh, don't tell me that. I want to do this with the guy I'm dating. Like, I don't want to do this by myself. I mean, I have to break up with him so I can like mature. Like, oh God. Like,
yeah, 100%. It makes me think I'm super obsessed with the hero's journey. And so it's a whole structure that we can actually we can use in our own lives. And this is why I like to start my episodes asking, what's your once upon a time? Because this definitely it gives an interesting structure that can give you insights in maybe what's your next step, what you're needing now in this chapter of your life? Is it about surrendering to the crisis?
Right.
Is it about creating this new version of your character with new superpowers that you developed through this difficulty that you just passed?
Yeah.
So you founded your own tutoring company. You created a school, right? And most recently, you co-founded the Thiel Fellowship and the 1517 Funds. What passionates you with spending time with young people?
Yeah, that goes back to reading that book and finding my calling. And I don't remember, so like one of my deepest regrets is like I gave up that book at some point. Like I, put it in the, like giveaway pile. I'm like, what was I thinking? I should have kept it there. I had handwritten notes in there. Wow. So I wish I knew exactly what it said. But the mission that I've fallen on over time is like my personal calling is to bring, freedom and autonomy to young people. And there's a big piece of that. That's also agency. And what I've noticed over time is that my definition of a young person changes. So when I was running my tutoring company in my early 20s, to me, a young person was someone who was like, I don't know, a middle schooler or younger, or maybe a high schooler and younger, even though when I think back on it, I'm like, developmentally, I was not that far away in some sense from, especially the high schoolers I was working with. And then when I started my charter school, I was like more getting into my like mid to late 20s. And it was like my definition of a young person like shifted upwards a little bit more. And then when I got to the Thiel Foundation, I was like, okay, I was like just about to turn 30. And I was like, okay, my definition of a young person is changing again, of like, oh yeah, like those 20-year-olds, like they need something. So I'm very curious about how my own relationship to young people will change over time, because I'm getting older every day. And I'm like, and I joke with people that like someday I'm going to be like, I'll be 60. I'm like, yeah, those 40-year-olds, they really need like whatever it is. But it's also morphed a little bit too, in terms of like, over time, I've also gotten more interested in like human rights in general. And for me, I do have a very particular deep passion around like human rights for young people, but it has like expanded more into like, I want freedom and autonomy for people, period. And so I'll be curious to see sort of where that goes. But when I moved to the Bay Area, I was doing a staycation. I didn't know what I was going to do for work. And I had decided that school principalship was not my calling. I love my school. I've been on the board since the very beginning. So I've been on the board of the school for like, 14 years or something like that. But I also learned that I definitely have like a pretty active ADHD type of brain that is always like, let's have today be totally new and different. And going to the same location at the same time every day. And also when you're an administrator at a school, you have almost, it's not no contact with children, but it's like very little and very limited. And I started the school so that I could, bring more of this freedom and autonomy to young people, but then I was disconnected from the people I was serving. I was, in touch with their parents a lot, and I was in touch with the district a lot. And that was less gratifying for me. So I had moved to the Bay Area, and I didn't know what I was going to do. And it was a very nerve-wracking time, and it took a lot of sort of faith to hold that staycation time period, because I've also worked in some sense, like, maybe certainly not full-time when I was 12, but like always had sort of a job somewhere doing something. And so to say I'm going to do a staycation and not work and not earn income and not build my savings account was extremely threatening. And I knew my personal mission, and people were starting to come forward and say like, hey, I have this nonprofit, and you've operated things and you'd be great at this. And like they'd be like science and tech focused, and that was a fit for me, but it didn't have like the young person agency piece to it. And so I had to keep saying no to things, and it felt really uncomfortable, because I like, part of me felt guilty, like, oh my God, this person who's like to me, like a mentor in the Bay Area has come to me with an organization and is like, hey, like you could be great for running this. I want to give it to you. And I was like, I have to say no, like, because it's not a fit for me.
Yeah.
And 3 months into my staycation, a friend called, and I had worked with her on some event stuff. And she said her exact words were, the Thiel Foundation has lost their minds. They're starting this program and they have nobody running it. And like, I was like, well, that's weird. I was like, who starts a program and has nobody running it? Like my charter school operator, small business brain was like, who does that? Like, of course you have a pilot and of course you get all your ducks in a row and you sort of like just try things out and experiment and do something small and then do a big splash. And it's like, oh, Peter Thiel does this, of course. So that for me was so in line with my personal beliefs and my personal mission that I was like, okay, staycation needs to go. Like I need to interview for this and, then when given the opportunity, just say yes to like get on the ground floor of this thing. And that's how it started. And what I loved so much, both about the Thiel Fellowship and about 1517, is I got to integrate my philosophy around just how you treat human beings, period, but especially children, deeply into those programs. And I had big impact, but very in the moment time with the young people I was working with. So when I was a school administrator, I was having a lot more big impact than when I was a private tutor, just working one-on-one with somebody. But the light bulb goes off moment was gone. And it was like, okay, I'm making a big impact, but it's like at the expense of being able to like really connect. And then with the Thiel Fellowship, it was like huge impact. People are pissed off around the world about what we're doing. And I get to work with people like Laura Deming and Dylan Fields and Dale Stevens and like all these people one-on-one and like experience them as human beings and, learn a lot myself. And so there was a lot of that, like, it was, because I remembered when I left my charter school, I was nervous. I was like, what am I going to be able to find that has like that big impact? Like now I've had a taste of doing something bigger than like direct service. But I also wanted to have like time with actual people who I cared about. And so that's been the beauty of both the Thiel Fellowship and 1517 for me is like, it's the big mission impact of saying like, hey, guess what? Like alternatives exist and it's okay to think for yourself and do something different. And, our motto at the Thiel Foundation was some ideas just can't wait. Yeah. And it was like, yeah, like let's go out and do that. And I get to work with this cohort of awesome young people.
That sounds amazing.
Yeah. It was so fun. It was so fun.
Yeah.
And with the 1517, it's very much the same. I tell people now that like I get to drink from the fountain of youth every single day, which keeps me current on all kinds of things. And then secondarily, I get to give resources to people to make their dreams come true. Like I have the best like life. I don't call it it doesn't occur to me like a job. I'm not like, 1517 is my job. It's like, it's my life. It's a part of my life. But it is a big part. And, I just feel like very blessed and charmed to be able to do this in a sustainable way thus far and want to continue that.
I'm wondering so you built all those different projects that sound very unconventional. Mm-hmm. And I wonder what was the most maybe challenging aspect of building something that's seen as unconventional, whether by society or by your family and friends. Would love to hear.
I think like the biggest sort of like struggle or jumping point was the charter school that I started, because me and my co-founder of that, Christine Kuglin, we were two very passionate homeschoolers, and she is 20 years older than I am and had raised her children or was in the process of raising her 4 children. And I was part of the homeschooling co-op that she started. And we went off to like do this adventure and in starting a charter school. And one thing that's beautiful about being naive about what you're getting into is that you have zero visceral sense of the challenge. You're like, oh yeah, I know there's going to be challenges. You don't know, like, wow, like hitting the wall hurt. Like, you have no idea. And so we were both really naive about like the challenge of starting a school. And so we learned a ton, but it was just so gratifying. And it was my first time really stepping into learning how to be a leader at a bigger scale. It was like, we literally went from working in a coffee shop on our charter petition, which is this 400-page document that you take to the district, and you've got to stand in front of the San Diego Unified Board, which is one of the largest districts in the country, and you got to make your case. And I used my speech and debate skills and was like, all right, like, here's why we're doing this. And you have to kind of be flying by the seat of your pants and telling people that what you're doing is going to work, even though you've never done it before. It's like, this is all research based, and here's why this and that and the other thing. And you're like, I hope it works. And I remember we went from, being two women who had this idea to opening the school doors to 160 children the first year, and, counting parents and other family members. It's like we had a community of, I think it was like 300 people, including the families. We had a staff of 14 people. I had never hired and fired people before. I had never run processes for families. We had to select and design curriculum. There was a lot of leadership, including even just onboarding of people would come to our school and hear about our mission, and they'd be like, oh, this is amazing. I love it. They'd get into the lottery, and then the parents would come to the school, and we were we're pretty strict about we do at our school's Innovations Academy, and we say we do it the IA way. Mm-hmm. And certain IA way things are really deep into our philosophy, but it gets expressed in action. And so one of those actions is, well, what is the IA way around what we call each other? And at IA, we just call each other by our first names. I'm not Miss Danielle, I'm just Danielle there. She's not Miss Christine, she's Christine there. And we were both head of school. And parents would come in, the first few weeks of school, and even later new parents would come in, they'd be like, I love IA so much, it's so amazing, but by the way, my kid is going to call you Miss Strachman. And I was like, what? One, wow. You don't get to choose that, and two, this is part of the IA way. And so you don't get to this isn't shopping at the grocery store where you're like, I'll have a little of this tea and I'll have a little chocolate and I'll leave that over there. It's you take the package. Yeah. You either are on board and you're willing to sort of abide by what we do, or you're not on board and you go grocery shopping in another school. That's how it works. And oh man, the struggle was real, and the leadership that it took to hold on to what we saw. And what was interesting is there's this struggle of, in startups, it's okay, customer development and talking to people. And there were areas where the population we served our first year was very different than the anticipated population, because we thought we'd serve a lot of homeschooling families. And it was 2008, the recession had started. We didn't understand what was going on at all. All we knew was that people, gas prices were up and people couldn't drive as far. And so we mostly got local families in the community coming. So they weren't coming for the mission of the school. They were coming because it was easy to get to our school. And then we had to onboard and set mission and vision. We had families who had very different parenting practices than what we would want, at our school. We use a methodology called positive discipline, which everybody knows about now. When we started the school 15 years ago, no one knew what positive discipline was. We were seen as this weird, touchy-feely, social-emotional school. In fact, our 8th graders, the first year, called our social-emotional program So Emo. They're like, what's this So Emo thing? We were like, someday people will understand this, and people get it now. But we were seen as pretty radical, and it taught us just a lot about leadership and setting boundaries with people and keeping a staff engaged. We would tell our staff, it was funny because we weren't in the culture of startups, but we would tell them this is kind of like a startup. We didn't know what we're talking about, but we're each class is kind of your own business in here. And yes, you're doing it your own way, but it still needs to be the IA way. And like the IA ways, we do not use rewards and punishments. There's no, you're going to get a smiley face or a frowny face. There's no collective marble jar where the class is going to have a pizza party. Like, we do not believe in that type of manipulation of human beings. And so we don't do it. And that was really hard for teachers too, because they were like, but it is positive. I'm doing it positively. And we're like, but that's not what positive discipline is. Like, positive discipline is about really understanding where a student is at. It's a lot of talk therapy. It's not about marble jars and pizza parties and things like that. So it was both the most challenging thing and the most rewarding thing, because the growth curve that I had to be on to do it was extreme. Like, I mean, and there were days when my colleague Christine and I, and you know, we've been best friends forever, we would pass each other in the hallway and we'd stop and we'd whisper, like, who allowed this? Somebody allowed us to open a school, and we have staff and children here, and we're in a physical building. Like, we have no idea what we're doing. I had pink and purple hair. I was 28 years old when the school opened. And so when I look back, I'm like, oh my God, those parents really trusted me. And like, I tended to be more of the liaison between the parents and the school, and my colleague was more of the liaison between staff and the school. And like, it was all mixed up together. But I was like, wow, like I would have these multi-hour conversations with parents in my office about their lives and their families and what they were going through. And I look back and I'm like, some of them were old enough to like be like an aunt or uncle of mine. And I was like, I can't believe they took me seriously at all. Like that bias wasn't there. So and we used to always tell them, like, especially the first year parents, like, you all signed up to be guinea pigs of a grand experiment, and it's going to take us a long time to understand what's happened. Like, we're not going to know after the first year, although we did have some neat results. Like, we had an 8th grader who's only with us for 1 year. She was the type of young person who was truant from her other schools, hated school. She came to us and, like, you know, we're first name basis. We treat you like a human. There's a no paperwork homework policy. It's like, we might send young people home with a discussion topic, or like, hey, like, go look at the stars and tell me what you saw. But there's no like, here's your workbook kind of stuff. And so that environment really worked for her, and she went to high school the next year. And I remember her mom came back because she had a younger sister who was at our school. She's like, oh, she's doing fabulously. She's doing her homework. She loves school again. And it's because of what you guys injected in that 1 year. And I was like, wow, I can't believe we were able to have that effect in 1 year, when, you know, we were certainly having a lot of students who needed a lot of support. Yeah. And I was like, I don't know how much we can do. So yeah, a really powerful experience, and remains to be a powerful experience, because we have a building now. We're more mature as an organization. We're starting to think about sustainability of the org, and what does it mean to be like a standout school in San Diego? At some point, do we want to open more? Like, so all these things are like an evolving conversation.
That's so exciting to hear more about that story. What was very interesting for me to hear, and to which I relate so much, is this bias you talked about on not realizing how big is the challenge you're getting into. And this made me reflect on when I dropped out of school and I thought that I would revolutionize the French education system in like a year or two. And this whole, I feel like it's fascinating when you become an adult, because you really get to understand better the size of the challenge you're getting, the time it will take. And and again, and so maybe we can use that as the opportunity to come back to the bookmark.
Oh, sure.
Difficulty of becoming an adult in today's world. I feel like we're not prepared. I think it's bias that can be very positive. It's something that also happened to me, and that led me into very great experiences in which I learned a lot. And I wonder how would it look like if we created a system that instead of removing any agency from students, we would give them funds to develop their
Right.
projects,
Sure.
a support system, a
Right.
community,
Yeah.
like you do.
Yeah, and even just, I was brainstorming some new ideas today with a few people, and one thing we were talking about is even like just this sense of play is gone. For young people, for people who are, in their teens and 20s, like, and what play, I think, ended up looking like when you were like in your 20s was like sort of that prankster archetype of like, like you would do something kind of weird and maybe you're going to get in trouble for it, but it was seen as like, all right, isn't that funny that people did something, and not, it wasn't seen as like alarming or meddling, or I mean, it was maybe seen as meddling, but it was like people expected it was like part of the natural course of maturation of like, okay, yeah, of course MIT kids took apart a police car and put it on the dome. Like, of course they did. Like, this is what you do. And in fact, there's a great history behind some of these pranks, but we have extinguished it. And I think what I've noticed very recently is, it's funny. One thing I've said is like, one reason I'm very interested in radical life extension is that maybe if people lived like 1,000 years, we would have more of like a catalog of like what used to be normal at different times, or like that sense of like, oh yeah, history is doomed to repeat itself. Part of me just wonders how much of that is that like we're just not good at learning from abstraction. And I'm not saying we're all that good at learning from our elders either, because I don't think we are. I'm probably deeply included in that statement. I should probably spend even more time than I do with our elders. But it's like this idea that I have. And one thing that came up for me recently is I was on the Oberlin campus last week, and I met these wonderful students. They were vivacious and curious and multicultural and just really interesting people. Like, I've done many campus visits for over a decade now, and this particular visit made me more impressed than I've been on a campus visit in a long time. And I was doing office hours and learning about what people were working on. And it wasn't even that these students were working on things that were like extra novel, but it was like the energy that they were bringing to things that was really like churning. Like, there was real, like, I want to go do something out there. And it's interesting. I have a coach that I work with, and I was telling her about this experience, and she piped up and she goes, oh, I went to Oberlin. And I'm not entirely sure how old she is, but I'm guessing she's in her like late 50s, early 60s. And I was like, oh, interesting. And I was like, how would you describe Oberlin students from the past? And she was like, yeah, we were kind of like renegades. It's like, apparently, I haven't looked this up yet, but she was telling me that the first school and like the first student groups to protest the Vietnam War were at Oberlin. And I was like, oh, that's really interesting to me, because the experience I had was I had these conversations with these vivacious and interesting young people. And this one young man came in for office hours, and he's like, this might be like outside of 15-17's purview, but I want to tell you what I'm working on. And I was like, sure, shoot. Like, when we do office hours, we do them totally open. We don't vet people beforehand, because we love the serendipitous aspect of like, if someone wants something and they're taking the time and energy to come to us, like we just want to learn more. Yeah. And so he sits down and he's like, well, we don't have any parties on campus. And I was like, wait, what? Like, what do you mean you don't have any parties on campus? And he's like, yeah, there's this rule. And he's like, because of COVID, the administration has like come down and kind of cracked down on the social life on campus. Because it used to be you had to stay away from each other, and you could only have so many people in the library, and you could only have so many people doing this and that. And one of the things that the administration put down was you couldn't have more than 8 people in a dorm room. And the idea was that if you had more than 8 people in a dorm room, they considered it a party. So if you wanted to have more than 8 people or 8 people plus in your dorm room, you'd have to call an RA, get their approval, and then you could have people in your dorm room. And this was last week, and I was like, what are you talking about? Like, I'm thinking to myself, you're like over 18 years old. You're paying a lot more money than like people used to pay in the past to go to Oberlin. Oberlin also, I think, has a lot of international students, which means they're paying like full tuition. And this is what you get? Like, my mind was totally blown. I mean, I have been on the like college sucks train for a long time now, but there was something about this particular moment which was like the nail in the coffin for me. And so we're talking about how he wants to start these parties, and he's got some like, there's some housing groups on campus that he can do it at that like are on campus but not owned by the campus, so they can get around these rules and blah, blah, blah. And so there's all this like finagling just to socialize. And I'm keeping all these notes as I'm talking to students that day. And I've never done this before either when I'm on a campus, but you know, it's this neat perspective of I'd been on campus, I had talked to like, I don't know, maybe like 15 students. And then they wanted me to give a presentation at the end of the day about entrepreneurship and funding and all this stuff. And I was like, oh, I can bake in an Oberlin slide. So I baked in this slide of like my takeaways from campus today of like what I'm noticing about the student body here, what I'm noticing about the school, and like sort of like, you know, what are Danielle's recommendations from being here on campus for like all of 12 hours or whatever. Yeah, the Danielle audit, exactly. So I made this slide. Like, it's funny. The guy who invited me to come to campus is like newer to campus, and he's running entrepreneurial groups there, and he's really, really great. And I was like, I just need like 5 minutes to bang out some bullet points on this slide. Like, but I have some like reflections to share. And so like, you know, I had some like, I don't know, normal bullet points that I went through at the end, and I'd given, you know, the 15-17 talk. And then it was interesting. It was one of these moments where like the amount of emotion that came out of me was way bigger than I had anticipated. And like one of the bullet points, it's like there's all these bullet points, and I got to this one, and it said Oberlin students need to take back the culture of their campus. And so then I started like extemporaneously speaking to them, and it's like no more than 20 of them in a room. This is not a big group. Yeah. And I'm like, you guys, you have to take back the culture of your campus. Like, the administration has crushed it, you know, for probably many reasons, but I think a lot of it has to do with COVID. And I heard about how you can only have 8 people or 7 people in your dorm room before you have to call an RA. And I just started shouting. I was like, Oberlin used to be fucking weird. Like, people I knew who went there, they were the weird, unique people. Like, they wouldn't have put up with this. They would have fought the administration and said, this is bullshit. And like, the students are like sitting in their chairs, like kind of glazed over, kind of like, oh, Danielle's lost her mind. Like at the end of this hour-long talk I gave, and I yelled like Oberlin used to be fucking weird, like positively fucking weird, like multiple times. And I was like, listen, like, you are now paying for extremely high-priced babysitting. You are not allowed as an adult to have more than 8 people in your dorm room. Like, I was so mad. And then I almost started crying at the end. I was so like both enraged, but mostly enraged for them. Like, guys, like, and the thing that really got me was like, they don't know. They don't know to be mad about this. And so then what dawned on me was like, we need to get alums going back to their college campuses and being like, oh, look, this place is fucking bland and vanilla now. There are no pranks here. There's no fighting the administration about stuff. It's the good little students sitting and just taking it, and they're paying a lot to take it. Yeah. Like, oh my God.
The institution won. Yeah. This institution won over the freedom of the students and the creativity.
Yeah. And like that would not happen in the past. Or I remember when MIT shut down the frats, like there were a lot of people and a lot of alums who stepped up and were like, this is wrong. And like, they still did it. But like people stepped up to the plate, and I'm like, oh my God, these students don't even know to step up to the plate. Like, cause they don't know that something's wrong. And so, yeah, that idea of like this, like at like the lowest bar of college for me could be that it could be a place where you maturate some. I don't think anyone should be there 4 years anymore. It's too long. But it's like just 1 year of like good maturation and being able to get in trouble and learn how do you I had a roommate who had parties in our room all the time, and I hated it. I hated it. I had clarinet lessons early on Saturday mornings, and I remember sitting next to a friend of mine at lunch, and I was like, and it was Friday, and she's talking about how she's going to this party this evening, and I was like, oh, like, where, like, she's telling me about this party, and I was like, oh, where's the party? And all of a sudden she gets really quiet. And my roommate had been throwing parties in our room for like a while. And I said, is a party in my room? And she says, and I was like, oh, Megan, like my old roommate. I was like, oh, she's driving me crazy. Like, but I had to navigate, like, how to set boundaries with people. I had to navigate, like, where do I go sleep? Like, it wasn't fun. Like, that year was terrible. But would I have said the administration should have, like just put down a rule to stop it? I don't think so. I think I would have wanted more support of like, hey, how do I navigate this? Like, maybe had I been a party person or not had clarinet lessons on Saturday mornings, I would have been into it. But like, I didn't have a good way to negotiate. But should I, would I have wanted the administration to come down with like a policy to just make it wrong for anybody to do that? Like, in my opinion, of course not. So yeah, I think young people are being robbed of the right to grow up, whether that's not going to school at all and being able to maturate in the real environment of like, okay, here's what happens when you leave the house, and the environment of school of like, here's what happens when you're in an institutional culture, and that actually part of being part of an institution is questioning the institution. It's like back to that hero's journey again of like, you're in an institution, you leave it, and you in that hero's journey, you come back full circle. But that is not, it's not allowed. And like the thing that really like gets me is that like the students just don't know. It's like they're totally blind to that you could have a voice. So that's why I'm like, okay, we need to get alums to go back to campus and see how bad it sucks. And maybe alums are actually how we fight like some of these things, because they remember when school used to be really different and you had more choices and agency and you could fight the administration about things. And it wasn't about that we're a school that fights these things on the outside only. It was like that we're a school and we're actually dealing with our own stuff on the inside. So something I feel very passionate about in the last week. I'm like, oh my God, you can't have a party? What's wrong?
This is insane. Yeah.
Well, especially paying so much for it. I'm like, like, this is literally high-priced babysitting. It's like childcare has always, well, not always, but childcare has gotten increasingly expensive over time. And this is like the cream of the crop childcare at this point. For your 18-year-old. Like, which is disgusting.
It is. It's super interesting because it makes me think of a conversation I had with some 22 years old entrepreneurs 2 days ago, and we were talking about how our generation is really probably lacking of drive for bigger purpose and dream, and therefore does not question institutions as much as they should probably.
And it goes back to play. Young people today, and when you were growing up, didn't have access to free play. Everything was structured play. You have this activity at this time with these rules.
Right. Interesting insights. Yeah. What would you say for the young people that might be in that situation where they do have the self-awareness to realize that the institutions they're part of are wrong, or they are not doing a great job, but they might not have the community? What would be, maybe as a final question, your advice for those people that feel lost with their path, maybe are still part of the system kind of, and question themselves and feel anxious because as in my early 20s myself, I think that it's a time where you feel a lot of pressure on finding your path.
For me, I think a lot of it comes down to, it does take getting outside your comfort zone and putting yourself out there and doing things like writing something up about what you think is wrong on campus and posting it somewhere. And I think people get obsessed with reach. They're like, oh, only 5 people liked the thing I posted, so it means it's not good because only 5 people liked it or something like that. And one thing that we learned over time in the Thiel Fellowship is that quality is way better than quantity, and alignment is quality. And so if you have 4 people who come to your event who are like values aligned with you, that's way better than having a 400 person event and they're not actually aligned. And I think the same is true with activism in general. And like it's funny, you're taking me back to some times when I was at Simmons. I remember, I think it was the Campus Crusade for Christ. They had put up these flyers and paper flyers, and I don't know how much paper flyers happen on campus now. But it was this poster that had something to do with like essentially getting your MRS degree and getting married. And I was pissed about it. And I wrote in hand in like colored pencil. I don't know why I did colored pencil, but like I wrote this whole like just like rant that I just posted to my door. And like that's the only place it was, but other young women at the school would walk by and like sort of notice it, and then they would read it, and then like we would have a conversation about it. And I was like, I just think it's insane that on, our liberal women's campus, there are these posters up like telling us to be concerned about getting our MRS degree, and like this is like jarring to me. And I wasn't in the camp of like, oh, we need to make them stop or take it down. It was more just like I just wanted to have a dialogue about this idea that we should be focused or obsessed with like we are the man we're with or something like that. Especially on a campus that has a heavy lesbian population. I was like, I'm pretty sure these 2 on the couch over here, they're definitely not getting their MRS degree, or at least not right now because gay marriage wasn't legal yet. So just like, putting yourself out there and finding the small handful of people. Or like I remember a friend of mine told me she found her tribe on campus because someone had like written in chalk on the sidewalk about something that she cared about. And they had put their phone number, and it was their dorm phone number. This is before cell phones. Wow. And it was like, you have to call this like dorm room or like go knock on a door to talk to somebody. And I think conversations like that really can start building something. And I would be so sure that so many things that happen on campus just are happening in common space where it's like, hey, someone who is, willing to say like, hey, by the way, I've been thinking about this whole 8-room party thing. Let's talk about it while we're at lunch, and then getting riled up about it and writing to the administration, or, having 8-person party day on campus where everybody on campus has more than 8 people in their room, or, whatever it is, to be like, hey, we are stronger as a group here for this. So I think it can look different ways for people to like go up against institutions, but I am a believer in grassroots efforts. And it's a lot of how, we've built things with 1517 is like that grassroots level of going to campuses and setting up a table with a tablecloth and people being like, what's this? Are you guys A16Z? Because they see a number and they like think there's something else. And we're like, no, like, and then just sharing what we're doing. And over time you get reach about something. And over time, that impact comes. But I think what's coming to mind right now is like, we need to delay gratification of like, the thing that I'm working on has to happen right now. The end result cannot happen today. The end result is something that happens over time. So maybe it's like, all right, I'm frustrated on campus. I'm frustrated in the system. I'm frustrated at work. Like, use that energy to kind of move you forward. We took a training when I started my charter school. I wish I could remember what it was called, but it was a personal development training. And this woman presented this concept called angergy. And it was like anger plus energy equaled angergy. And it was like, use your anger to actually make something happen, because that kind of energy is generative. It can be destructive. Like, so you have to figure out how you're channeling it. But if you channel it like in a particular way, you can like go forth and make something happen instead of just being in the like, it's okay, I'll just be kind of chill about it mentality, where, yeah, maybe it's good to be chill about things sometimes, but maybe it's really good not to be.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your time.
Fun.
That was so fun.
Yeah.
I really loved it.
Yeah, me
Thanks
too.
for your insights.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for the amazing questions and conversation.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast. I really enjoy the support. Many more awesome episodes are coming your way, and you can also follow me at Zelda Poem for more content on how to navigate life as a young hacker, founder, or unconventional being. See you next week.